A hungry, dirty girl appeared at the door of a wealthy mansion. The man who took her in never imagined that this stranger would discover a devastating secret about his family. The forest was dark, and the girl felt her legs weakening. She hadn't eaten properly in days, and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. She kept walking, branches snapping under her bare feet. Her clothes were torn, her hair tangled, and her face smudged with dirt. She looked around, her eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Each rustle made her heart race. She knew the forest wasn't safe, but she had nowhere else to go. Ahead, she noticed a light, distant, faint. It was like a beacon in the sea of darkness. The girl paused, her body shivering from cold. What if the people there turned her away? What if they called the police? Her heart pounded in her ears, but she had no choice. She had reached the edge of her strength. She stumbled forward, her bare feet crunching on dead leaves and twigs. The mansion stood tall, the lights glowing through the windows. She could see the shape of it as she approached. A gate with high walls, the kind of place she had never been close to. Rich people lived there. She hesitated, standing outside the gate. She felt small, like she didn't belong. The cold cut through her thin shirt, biting into her skin. Her stomach growled, and her hands shook as she wrapped her arms around herself. She forced herself to walk through the gate, up to the door. She stared at the doorbell, her finger hovering over it. It was now or never. She pressed it. A distant chime echoed from within the house. She held her breath, waiting. The door opened, and a man stood there. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that scanned her quickly. He frowned. "What are you doing here?" His voice was harsh. The girl swallowed, her throat dry. "Please, I need help. I don't have anywhere to go." The man didn't speak for a moment. He just stared at her, his eyes cold, assessing. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. She hesitated, unsure if it was an invitation or a warning. He looked at her again, this time with a sigh, and gestured for her to enter. She stepped inside, feeling warmth envelop her. The house was huge, the ceilings high, the furniture clean and polished. She felt out of place, like she'd walked into another world. Her eyes moved around, taking in the chandeliers, the paintings on the walls. Everything looked expensive. The man closed the door, locking it behind her. "Who are you?" he asked, still watching her. "My name is Anna," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, though he didn't seem interested. "Follow me." Anna followed him through the hallway, her feet sinking into the plush carpet. He led her to a sitting room, where an elderly woman sat in a wheelchair, her eyes focused on a book in her lap. She looked up, her gaze shifting between Anna and the man. "Who is this?" the woman asked, her voice softer but filled with curiosity. "She says she needs help," the man replied. He looked at Anna, his expression unreadable. "I haven't decided yet if we're giving it." Anna stood there, not sure what to say. Her stomach twisted, and her legs felt like they could give out at any second. She wished she could vanish, but she stood still, too tired to think of running. The woman in the wheelchair studied her, her eyes narrowing. "What's your name?" she asked. "Anna," she replied. The woman gave a slight nod. "You're cold," she said. She looked at the man. "Get her a blanket, Mark." Mark hesitated but left the room without a word. Anna stood there, feeling awkward and exposed. The old woman gestured toward a chair. "Sit down, girl. You look like you'll fall over." Anna moved to the chair and sank into it, her body sagging with exhaustion. She watched the woman, waiting for her to say something. The woman didn't. She just stared, her eyes sharp, like she was trying to read her. "Where are you from?" the woman finally asked. I don't have anywhere to go," Anna said, her voice cracking. She didn't want to lie, but she wasn't ready to tell them everything. Not yet. The woman seemed to understand. She didn't ask more questions. Mark returned with a blanket. He handed it to Anna, who wrapped it around herself, grateful for the warmth. He still looked at her with suspicion, but he didn't say anything. The woman spoke instead. "You can stay the night," she said, "but only tonight. We don't know you." Anna nodded. "Thank you, I promise. I won't cause any trouble." The woman smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was more of a polite gesture. "We'll see," she said. "Mark will show you to a room." Mark gestured for Anna to follow him. She stood, her legs shaky, and followed him up a grand staircase. He opened a door at the end of a hallway and pointed inside. "You can sleep here," he said. His voice was flat, not inviting. "There's a bathroom through that door. Don't wander around." My mother doesn't like strangers. Anna nodded, stepping into the room. It was bigger than any place she had ever stayed. The bed was large, with clean sheets. There was a window, but all she saw outside was darkness. Mark stayed by the door for a moment, watching her. "Don't steal anything," he said finally. Anna looked at him, her eyes wide. "I won't." He nodded, then left, closing the door behind him. Anna stood in the middle of the room, unsure of what to do. She heard the lock click. He had locked her in. Her heart sank, but she was too tired to react. She moved to the bed and sat down, pulling the blanket tight around her shoulders. She had no idea what would happen in the morning. She didn't know if they would let her stay or send her away. But for tonight, she had warmth and safety. Her eyes grew heavy, and she let herself lie down, exhaustion taking over. She was asleep before she could think of anything else. Morning came with sunlight streaming through the window. Anna woke up slowly, her body stiff. She blinked, trying to remember where she was. The room felt foreign, too clean, too big. She pushed herself up, still wrapped in the blanket. The events of last night came rushing back. She was in a mansion, taken in by strangers. Her stomach turned, unsure of what to expect now. There was a knock on the door, and Mark's voice came through. "Get up. Breakfast is downstairs." Anna got out of bed, quickly smoothing her hair with her fingers. She didn't have other clothes, just the dirty ones she was wearing. She opened the door, and Mark stood there, expression as unreadable as ever. He looked her over, then turned. "Come on," he said, his voice flat. Anna followed him down the hall, feeling out of place. She could hear the clinking of dishes as they neared the kitchen. The smell of coffee and something frying filled the air, making her stomach growl. She hadn't had a proper meal in days. They entered a large, bright kitchen where the elderly woman was already seated at the table. She looked up as they came in, her eyes narrowing on Anna. "Sit," the woman said, gesturing to a chair across from her. Anna sat, glancing at the food spread on the table. There were scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon. Her mouth watered, but she hesitated, unsure if she was allowed to eat. Mark took a seat next to his mother, picking up his coffee cup without a word. The woman nodded toward the food. "Help yourself, Anna," she said. Anna reached for a piece of toast, her hands shaking slightly. She took a bite, the crunch loud in her ears. She tried not to eat too quickly, but the hunger gnawed at her. The woman watched her, sipping her own coffee. "Where did you come from?" she asked after a moment. Her voice was calm but probing. Anna paused, the toast halfway to her mouth. She swallowed, her throat dry. "I was in a small town, a couple of days' walk from here," she said. "I didn't have anywhere to stay." The woman nodded, her gaze never leaving Anna's face. "And why were you out there, in the forest?" Anna hesitated. She didn't want to share too much, not yet. "I was running away," she said, keeping her voice low. Mark scoffed softly, shaking his head. "Running away from what?" Anna looked down at her plate. "From everything. I didn't feel safe." The room was quiet for a moment, the tension heavy. The woman set her coffee cup down, the clink of porcelain breaking the silence. "You can stay here for now," she said, "but you'll need to help out. We're not running a charity." Anna nodded, her chest tightening. "I understand. I'll do whatever I can." Mark raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He just drank his coffee, his eyes fixed on something beyond the kitchen window. The woman gave Anna a small, polite smile. "We'll see how it goes," she said. "You'll start by helping me with the housework today." Anna felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She didn't know how long she could stay, but at least she wasn't being thrown out immediately. She finished her toast, trying to ignore the knots in her stomach. After breakfast, Mark left the kitchen without a word, and the woman wheeled herself closer to Anna. She nodded toward a bucket and a mop in the corner of the room. "You can start by cleaning the floors," she said. "Then we'll see what else needs doing." Anna stood up, moving toward the mop. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She wasn't used to this kind of place. The polished floors, the sparkling counters. She felt like she might break something just by being there. She took the mop and began working, moving slowly, carefully. The old woman watched her, giving instructions every now and then. Anna tried to follow them as best as she could, her body tense with every movement. The woman's eyes were always on her, critical, evaluating. Anna knew she had to prove herself if she wanted to stay. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. "Why did you really run away?" the woman asked suddenly. Her tone was sharp, and it caught Anna off guard. Anna paused, the mop hovering over the floor. She didn't look up. "I had a fight with my parents," she said, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't stay there anymore." The woman nodded slowly, her expression softening just a little. "Everyone here has something they're running from," she said. "You're not the only one." Anna looked at her, surprised by the comment, but the woman didn't elaborate. She just gestured for Anna to keep working. The day passed slowly. Anna mopped, dusted, and cleaned whatever the old woman pointed out. Mark appeared occasionally, watching them both without saying much. His eyes were cold, distant, and Anna felt like she was under a microscope. He didn't trust her. She could feel it with every look he gave her. In the late afternoon, Anna finished cleaning a room on the second floor. She looked out of the window, seeing the forest stretching out beyond the mansion grounds. She could still remember the feeling of being out there, the cold, the fear. Here, at least, there was warmth, food, and a roof over her head. But it didn't feel like home. It felt like she was walking on thin ice, every step a risk. Mark walked in as she stood by the window. He frowned. "Don't wander around the house," he said, his tone sharp. "You're here to help, not to explore." Anna turned quickly, her cheeks flushing. I was just looking." Mark narrowed his eyes, then turned and left without another word. Anna let out a shaky breath, her heart pounding. She had to be careful. One wrong move, and she'd be back out there, alone. By the time evening came, Anna was exhausted. Her muscles ached from all the work, but she didn't complain. The woman called her to the sitting room, where they had tea in silence. Mark sat in the corner, reading a newspaper, his eyes occasionally flicking to Anna. The woman poured tea, her hands steady. She looked at Anna, her gaze softer than it had been in the morning. "You did well today," she said. "But remember, you're still a guest here. We expect respect." Anna nodded, her voice quiet. "I understand. Thank you for letting me stay." The woman smiled, just a little. "We'll see how long you'll stay, Anna. It depends on you." The tension in the room was thick, but Anna felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe she could make it work here. Maybe she could prove herself. She sipped her tea, her eyes on her lap, trying to block out the weight of Mark's stare. The next few days settled into a kind of routine. Anna woke up early, helped the old woman with breakfast, cleaned, and kept herself out of trouble. Mark still didn't speak to her much, his eyes always cold, always watching. The old woman, whose name Anna learned was Margaret, was direct and gave orders without much emotion. But Anna felt a tiny bit of warmth behind her instructions. It was enough to keep Anna from feeling completely unwelcome. One afternoon, Anna was dusting the bookshelves in the sitting room when she heard voices coming from the hallway. She recognized Mark's voice, calm, serious, but there was another, unfamiliar one. It was a man's voice, low and agitated. She couldn't make out the words, but it sounded tense, like an argument. Anna tried to ignore it, but the voices got louder. Curiosity got the best of her, and she tiptoed toward the door, leaving it slightly ajar. She could hear them now, their words coming through more clearly. "Why did you bring her here?" The stranger's voice was sharp. "You know how risky it is." Mark's response was muffled, but Anna could hear the tension. She leaned closer, straining to listen. "It's none of your business, Paul," Mark replied, his tone clipped. "She was alone. I couldn't just leave her there." "She's a stranger, Mark," Paul shot back. "You know what happened last time. You're risking everything." Anna's heart skipped a beat. She took a step back, her mind racing. What were they talking about? What had happened before? She felt a chill run down her spine, her fingers tightening around the dusting cloth. She knew she shouldn't be listening, but she couldn't help it. Mark's voice softened, almost a whisper. "She doesn't know anything. She's just a kid, Paul." Paul scoffed, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Oh, you said the same thing before. Look where that got us." There was a long silence. Anna could feel her pulse in her ears, her breath shallow. She had no idea what they were talking about, but it sounded serious. It sounded like she was in the middle of something dangerous, something she didn't understand. Suddenly, there was a creak, and Anna realized too late that someone was coming toward the sitting room. She quickly stepped away from the door, turning back to the bookshelf, pretending to work. The door opened, and Paul stepped in. He was taller than Mark, his face lined, his eyes sharp. He looked at Anna, his expression unreadable. "You're the girl," he said, his voice flat. Anna nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Yes, sir." Paul looked at her for a long moment, then turned and left without another word. Mark followed, his face tight, his eyes catching Anna's for just a second. There was something in his expression, a warning, maybe even regret, but he didn't say anything. He closed the door behind them, leaving Anna alone. Anna stood there, her heart pounding. She felt a knot of fear in her stomach. What had they meant? What had happened before? She knew she couldn't ask. She was already on thin ice, and if they knew she had been eavesdropping, she'd be out of here for sure. That evening, Margaret noticed Anna was quiet, but she didn't press. They had dinner in the dining room, the air thick with unspoken tension. Mark was there, but Paul was gone, and no one mentioned him. Anna kept her head down, eating in silence, the questions burning in her mind. Later that night, after she'd helped Margaret to her room, Anna wandered down the hall, her mind still racing. She found herself in front of a door she hadn't noticed before. It was slightly open, and beyond it, she could see what looked like an office. Dark wood, books lining the walls, papers scattered on the desk. She knew she shouldn't, but she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Her eyes moved over the desk, the papers. There were old photographs, documents she couldn't quite understand. She picked up a photo, her eyes widening. It was of a young girl, maybe a little older than Anna. She had dark hair, and her face was solemn. Anna stared at it, her heart pounding. The girl looked familiar. She felt a strange pull, like she knew this person, even though she was sure she'd never seen her before. She put the photo down, her fingers trembling. She looked around the room, her eyes catching a piece of paper half hidden under a book. She pulled it out, her eyes skimming the words. It was a letter. The edges yellowed. The words were harsh, written in an angry hand. It mentioned betrayal, abandonment, and it was signed by someone named Emily. Suddenly, Anna heard footsteps, and she quickly put the paper back, her heart leaping into her throat. She turned just as the door opened. Mark stood there, his face dark, his eyes narrowing at her. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his voice cold. Anna swallowed, her mouth dry. I got lost. I'm sorry." Mark stepped closer, his eyes fixed on hers. For a moment she thought he might throw her out right then, but instead, he just shook his head, his jaw tight. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, his voice low. "There are things in this house you don't understand." Anna nodded quickly, her heart pounding. "I know. I'm sorry." Mark looked at her for a long time, then stepped aside, gesturing for her to leave. She moved past him, her body tense, her eyes on the floor. He followed her out, closing the door behind them. "Go to your room," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Anna nodded, her cheeks flushing. She hurried down the hall, her mind racing. She knew she shouldn't have gone in there, but she couldn't help it. There were secrets in this house, and they were connected to her. Somehow, she could feel it. When she reached her room, she closed the door, leaning against it, her breath shaky. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something she couldn't quite see. She didn't know what Mark was hiding, but she knew it wasn't good. She moved to the window, looking out at the forest beyond the mansion. It was dark, the trees swaying in the wind. She wondered if she should leave, if she should just run and not look back. But where would she go? She had no one, nowhere to turn. At least here, she had warmth, food, a roof over her head. For now, it would have to be enough. She turned away from the window, her eyes falling on the blanket on the bed. She pulled it around herself, sitting down, her mind still filled with questions. She didn't know what she had stumbled into, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. The secrets in this house were too close, too real. She had to find out the truth. Anna woke up with a feeling of heaviness in her chest. The tension of the previous night lingered like a shadow. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd made things worse for herself. She tried to move quietly, hoping to avoid Mark or Margaret, but she knew it was impossible to avoid them forever. She made her way to the kitchen. Margaret was already there, her wheelchair positioned by the table. She looked up as Anna entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Morning, Anna," Margaret said, her tone neutral. "You're up early." Anna nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral. "Good morning. I thought I'd help with breakfast." Margaret eyed her for a moment, then nodded. "Fine. You can start by boiling the water." Anna moved quickly, her hands trembling slightly. She filled the kettle, setting it on the stove. Margaret watched her, her eyes sharp, assessing. "Mark told me you were wandering around last night," Margaret said after a moment. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Anna froze, her heart skipping a beat. I got lost," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret didn't say anything for a moment. Then she sighed. Anna, there are places in this house you shouldn't go. It's for your own good. Anna nodded, her face flushing. I understand. I'm sorry. Margaret didn't respond. She just watched as Anna moved around the kitchen, her eyes never leaving her. The silence was heavy, but Anna kept working, trying not to let the fear show on her face. A few minutes later, Mark entered the kitchen. He glanced at Anna, then moved to the coffee pot, pouring himself a cup. He didn't say anything, but Anna could feel his presence like a weight. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the task in front of her. Margaret finally broke the silence. Mark, you should let Anna help with the garden today. It needs tending. Mark looked at his mother, then at Anna, his eyes narrowing slightly. Are you sure that's a good idea? He asked, his voice skeptical. Margaret nodded. Yes, she needs something to do, and you can keep an eye on her. Anna swallowed, her heart pounding. She didn't want to be alone with Mark, not after last night, but she nodded, not wanting to cause more trouble. Fine, Mark said finally, his tone cold. Come on then. Anna followed Mark out of the kitchen, her heart in her throat. They walked through the hallway and out to the garden, the air crisp and cool. Mark didn't say anything as they walked, his face set in a hard line. When they reached the garden, Mark handed Anna a pair of gloves. We're weeding, he said, his tone flat. Don't touch anything else. Anna nodded, taking the gloves. She knelt down, her hands working through the soil, pulling weeds. Mark worked a few feet away, his eyes occasionally flicking to her. The silence was thick, but Anna didn't dare break it. After a while, Mark spoke, his voice low. You shouldn't have gone into the office. Anna looked up at him, her hands pausing. I know. I'm sorry. Mark shook his head, his expression hard. You don't understand what you're dealing with. This house, it has a history, things that are better left alone. Anna swallowed, her heart pounding. What kind of history? Mark didn't answer right away. He just kept working, his hands moving through the dirt. Finally, he looked at her, his eyes cold. People have been hurt because of secrets in this house, he said. If you want to stay here, you need to know your place. Don't go looking for things you don't understand. Anna nodded, her stomach twisting. She didn't know what to say. She just kept working, her hands trembling slightly. She could feel the fear in her chest, the sense that she was in over her head. They worked in silence for the rest of the morning. When they finally finished, Mark stood, brushing the dirt off his hands. He looked at Anna, his expression still guarded. Go clean up, he said, his tone dismissive. Anna nodded, standing slowly. She made her way back to the house, her heart heavy. She knew she had made things worse for herself, but she couldn't ignore the questions in her mind. What had happened in this house? What were they hiding? She cleaned herself up, her hands still trembling. When she returned to the kitchen, Margaret was there, her eyes watching her closely. How did it go? Margaret asked, her tone casual. Anna forced a smile. Fine. We got a lot done. Margaret nodded, her eyes still sharp. Good. You need to learn your place here, Anna. This isn't just a house, it's a family, and families have rules. Anna nodded, her chest tight. I understand. Margaret watched her for a moment longer, then turned her attention back to the book on her lap. Anna stood there, unsure of what to do. She felt like she was walking on a tightrope, every step a risk, but she had nowhere else to go. The rest of the day passed in a blur of chores and silence. Anna worked alongside Margaret, trying to keep her head down, trying not to draw attention. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken words hanging between them. That evening, Mark was quieter than usual. He sat in the sitting room, his eyes focused on the fireplace, his expression distant. Margaret wheeled herself next to him, her eyes moving to Anna as she entered. Come, sit, Margaret said, her tone softer than before. Anna moved to the chair across from them, her body tense. She looked at Mark, then at Margaret, waiting for one of them to speak. Margaret sighed, her gaze softening. Mark told me you asked about the past, about what happened here. Anna swallowed, nodding. I just want to understand. Margaret looked at Mark, then back at Anna. There are things that happened here, Anna, things that left scars, not just on this house, but on us. Mark shifted in his seat, his eyes still on the fire. He didn't say anything, but Anna could see the tension in his shoulders. Margaret continued, her voice low. You're not the first person we've taken in. There was someone before you, a girl, like you. She didn't understand the rules. She got hurt. Anna's heart pounded, her stomach twisting. What happened to her? Margaret shook her head. She couldn't stay. She left, and she never came back. It was for the best. Anna nodded, her chest tightening. She could feel the fear in her chest, the sense that she was standing on the edge of something dangerous. She didn't know what to say, so she just sat there, the silence thick around them. Margaret gave her a small, sad smile. "We don't want that to happen again, but you need to understand, Anna. This house has rules, and you need to follow them." Anna nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I understand." Mark finally looked at her, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, she thought she saw something there, something softer, almost like regret. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. "Good," he said, his voice low. "Then maybe we can make this work." Anna nodded, her heart heavy. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, she was still here. She had to believe that was enough. Anna spent the next few days keeping her head down, doing her best to follow Margaret and Mark's rules. The tension that had built up over the past week seemed to settle, if only slightly. She cleaned, cooked, and worked in the garden, all while trying to avoid trouble. But the questions still burned in her mind. Who was the girl Margaret had mentioned? What had happened to her? One morning, as Anna was dusting in the sitting room, Mark walked in. He looked at her for a moment, his eyes cold but not as harsh as before. "Come with me," he said. Anna put down the duster and followed him out of the room. They walked through the hallway, past the kitchen, and down a set of stairs that led to the basement. Anna hesitated at the top of the stairs, her heart pounding. The basement was dark, the air cool and heavy. Mark gestured for her to follow, and she forced herself to step forward. At the bottom of the stairs, Mark opened a door and stepped aside, letting Anna in first. She walked into a room filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and shelves lined with paper. It was clear that this was a place no one had been in for a long time. Mark followed her in, closing the door behind them. "Why are we here?" Anna asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark walked over to one of the shelves, his eyes scanning the papers. He pulled out a box and opened it, revealing old photographs and letters. He handed one of the photographs to Anna. She took it, her fingers trembling. It was the same girl she had seen before, the one in the photograph in the office. She looked young, her eyes solemn. Anna looked at Mark, confused. "Who is she?" she asked. Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Her name was Emily. She was like you. She came here a few years ago. My mother took her in." Anna swallowed, her throat dry. "What happened to her?" Mark hesitated, then shook his head. "She was here for a while, but she couldn't follow the rules. She went looking for answers, just like you have. She found things she shouldn't have, and she left. We never heard from her again." Anna felt a chill run down her spine. She looked down at the photograph, her heart heavy. What did she find? Mark looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Secrets that should have stayed buried. My father, he was a complicated man. He did things that hurt people. When Emily found out, she couldn't stay. She was scared, and she ran." Anna looked at him, her eyes wide. "What kind of things?" Mark shook his head, his expression hardening. "Things that are better left in the past. My father is gone now, but the damage he did is still here. It's in this house, in the walls, in the people who live here." Anna felt her stomach twist. She didn't know what to say. She looked at the photograph again, her heart aching for the girl in the picture. She could see the fear in Emily's eyes, the same fear she felt now. Mark took the photograph from her, putting it back in the box. He closed it, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm telling you this because I don't want you to end up like her. If you want to stay here, you need to stop digging. You need to follow the rules." Anna nodded, her voice shaky. "I understand." Mark looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked to the door. He opened it, gesturing for her to follow. Anna walked up the stairs, her mind racing. She felt like she was drowning in question, but she knew she couldn't ask more. Not now, not if she wanted to stay. They reached the top of the stairs, and Mark closed the door behind them. He looked at her, his expression softening just a little. "You're not a prisoner here, Anna, but you need to know when to let things go." Anna nodded, her eyes on the floor. "I'll try." Mark sighed, then turned and walked away, leaving Anna standing alone in the hallway. She stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, then made her way back to the sitting room. She picked up the duster, her hands trembling. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Anna tried to focus on her chores, but her mind kept drifting back to the photograph, to the fear in Emily's eyes. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, that there were still secrets hiding in the shadows of the house. That evening, after dinner, Margaret called Anna to the sitting room. She was sitting by the fireplace, her eyes fixed on the flames. Mark was there too, sitting across from her, his expression distant. "Come sit, Anna," Margaret said, her voice softer than usual. Anna sat down, her body tense. She looked at Margaret, then at Mark, waiting for one of them to speak. Margaret sighed, her eyes moving to Anna. "Mark told me that he showed you the basement, that he told you about Emily." Anna nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret looked at the fire, her expression sad. Emily was a good girl, but she was too curious. She couldn't let things go, and it cost her. She left, and we never heard from her again. It broke my heart. Anna swallowed, her chest tightening. "I don't want to leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I want to stay. I'll follow the rules." Margaret looked at her, her eyes softening. "I hope you do, Anna, because this house can be a refuge, but it can also be a prison. It's up to you." Anna nodded, her eyes on the floor. She could feel Mark's eyes on her, but she didn't look up. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, every step a risk, but she had nowhere else to go. Margaret smiled, just a little. "You're a good girl, Anna. I can see that. But you need to be careful. There are things in this house that are better left in the past." Anna nodded again, her heart heavy. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She had to be careful. She had to follow the rules, or she would end up like Emily. Margaret looked at Mark, then back at Anna. "Go get some rest, dear. Tomorrow is another day." Anna stood, her legs shaky. She nodded, then turned and left the room, her heart pounding. She walked down the hallway, her mind racing. She knew she had to let it go, to stop digging, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to the story, more that she needed to know. When she reached her room, she closed the door, leaning against it, her breath shaky. She looked around the room, her eyes falling on the window. She moved to it, looking out at the dark forest beyond the mansion. She wondered if Emily had looked out this same window, had felt the same fear, the same uncertainty. She turned away, her eyes closing. She had to stay. She had to make this work. She couldn't go back to the forest, to the cold and the fear. She had to find a way to belong here, to follow the rules. She moved to the bed, sitting down, her heart heavy. She didn't know what the future held. But for now, she was still here, and that had to be enough. The morning sun streamed through the window, waking Anna from a restless sleep. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the fatigue. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on her mind. Mark's words, the photograph of Emily, and Margaret's warning. She knew she had to be careful. She had to prove she could be trusted if she wanted to stay. Anna made her way down to the kitchen, where Margaret was already seated by the table. Mark was at the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee. The tension in the air was palpable, but Anna took a deep breath, determined to act normal. "Morning, Anna," Margaret said, her voice calm. "Good morning," Anna replied, trying to muster a smile. She walked over to the stove, ready to help with breakfast. "Make some tea, dear," Margaret instructed, nodding toward the kettle. "I'd like some chamomile this morning." Anna nodded, filling the kettle with water and setting it to boil. She moved quickly, her hands steady as she worked. She could feel Mark watching her, but she kept her eyes on her task, focusing on getting everything just right. When the tea was ready, she poured a cup for Margaret and placed it in front of her. Margaret smiled, giving her a small nod of approval. "Thank you, Anna," Margaret said. Anna nodded, her chest loosening just a bit. She glanced at Mark, who was still standing at the counter, sipping his coffee. He didn't say anything, but there was no harshness in his gaze this morning. That was something, at least. Margaret looked between them, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Mark, I think it would be good if Anna helped you in the garden again today." Mark looked at his mother, his lips pressing into a thin line. He seemed reluctant, but finally, he nodded. "Fine," he said, setting his coffee cup down. He looked at Anna. "Finish your breakfast first." Anna nodded, sitting down at the table. She picked at a piece of toast, her appetite gone. Margaret watched her, her eyes thoughtful, but she didn't say anything. The silence hung between them, but it wasn't as heavy as before. It was almost as if an unspoken understanding had been reached. After breakfast, Mark led Anna out to the garden. The air was crisp, and the sun was shining through the branches of the trees, casting dappled shadows across the ground. Mark handed Anna a pair of gloves, his expression neutral. "We're pruning the rose bushes today," he said. "Be careful not to cut too much." Anna nodded, putting on the gloves. She followed Mark to the rows of rose bushes that lined the side of the house. She took the pruning shears he handed her fingers tightening around them. She worked quietly, trying to stay focused. Mark worked beside her, the silence stretching between them. Anna could feel the tension, the questions she still had, but she kept them to herself. She needed to prove she could be trusted, that she could follow the rules. After a while, Mark spoke, his voice breaking the silence. "Do you really want to stay here?" Anna looked up, surprised by the question. She met his eyes, unsure of what to say. "I do," she said finally, her voice steady. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Mark looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "This place, it's not perfect, but my mother wants to help you. She believes in second chances." Anna swallowed, her throat tight. "I know. I'm grateful for everything." Mark nodded again, his expression softening slightly. "Just remember, Anna, don't go looking for things you're not supposed to find. It's for your own good." Anna nodded, her eyes on the rose bushes. "I understand." They worked in silence for the rest of the morning. When they finally finished, Mark put down his shears and looked at her. "You did well today," he said. Anna gave him a small smile. "Thank you." Mark nodded, then turned and walked back toward the house. Anna watched him go, a strange sense of hope blossoming in her chest. Maybe things could get better. Maybe she could find a way to belong here. As they returned to the house, Margaret was waiting in the sitting room. She looked up as they entered, her eyes moving between Anna and Mark. "How did it go?" Margaret asked, her tone calm. Mark nodded. "She did well. No problems." Margaret smiled, a real smile this time. "Good. I knew you could do it, Anna." Anna felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was the first time she had felt anything close to acceptance since she arrived. She nodded, her voice soft. "Thank you, ma'am." Margaret looked at Mark, then back at Anna. "There are small things that need doing around the house. Help me in the kitchen, dear." Anna nodded, following Margaret into the kitchen. They worked together, peeling vegetables and preparing for dinner. The air felt lighter. The tension that had hung between them seemed to ease, if only a little. Margaret spoke as they worked, her voice gentle. "You know, Anna, it's been a long time since we had anyone here. It's not easy for us, taking someone in again." Anna looked at her, her hands pausing. "I know. I'm trying to do my best." Margaret nodded, her eyes softening. "I can see that. You're a good girl. You just need to be careful. Understand?" Anna nodded, her chest tightening. "I understand. I don't want to cause any trouble." Margaret smiled, patting her hand. "Good. We want you to feel safe here, but that means you have to follow the rules." Anna nodded, her heart pounding. "I will." Margaret looked at her for a moment longer, then turned her attention back to the vegetables. Anna continued working, her mind racing. She felt like she was getting closer to something. Acceptance, maybe even belonging. But she knew she couldn't make any mistakes, not if she wanted to stay. Later that evening, they all sat in the sitting room, the fire crackling in the fireplace. Mark was reading a book, his eyes focused on the pages. Margaret was knitting, her hands moving slowly, rhythmically. Anna sat quietly, her eyes on the flames. It was peaceful, almost comfortable. Margaret looked up from her knitting, her eyes moving to Anna. "Would you like to help me with the knitting, dear? It's not difficult to learn." Anna looked at her, surprised. I'd love to." Margaret smiled, handing her a pair of needles and a ball of yarn. "Start like this," she said, demonstrating the movement. Anna watched, then tried to mimic Margaret's movement. Her hands were clumsy at first, the yarn slipping between her fingers. But Margaret was patient, guiding her until she got the hang of it. Mark glanced at them, his eyes softening slightly as he watched Anna struggle with the knitting. He didn't say anything, but there was a hint of a smile on his lips. Anna caught his gaze for a moment, and he nodded, a silent acknowledgement. The evening passed slowly, the quiet companionship filling the room. For the first time since she had arrived, Anna felt something close to peace. She knew it wouldn't last forever, that there were still secrets lurking in the shadows of the house, but for now, it was enough. Margaret patted Anna's hand as they finished for the night. "You did well, dear. You're learning." Anna smiled, her heart swelling with a sense of hope. "Thank you, ma'am." Margaret nodded, her eyes warm. "We'll make it work, Anna. One day at a time." Anna nodded, her heart full. She still had questions, still had fears, but for now, she was here. She had a place, a chance, and she was determined to make it work. The days began to settle into a more predictable rhythm for Anna. She woke up early, helped Margaret with breakfast, and spent time in the garden with Mark. The tension had eased a bit, though there was still an underlying current of caution. Mark and Margaret seemed to be testing her, and Anna was careful not to step out of line. One morning, as Anna was helping Margaret in the kitchen, Margaret looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "Anna, how do you feel about learning to bake?" Anna blinked, surprised. "I've never really baked before, ma'am, but I'd love to learn." Margaret smiled, her eyes softening. "Good. It's a useful skill, and I think it'll be something nice for you to do. We could use some fresh bread today." Anna nodded eagerly, her heart lifting a little at the prospect of learning something new. Margaret handed her a worn cookbook, flipping to a page with a simple bread recipe. "Read through it, and I'll guide you," Margaret said. Anna studied the recipe, her eyes moving over the measurements and instructions. She began gathering ingredients, her movements careful and deliberate. Margaret watched her, occasionally giving instructions or correcting her technique. Anna followed every word, wanting to prove herself. As Anna kneaded the dough, Margaret sat back, her eyes thoughtful. "You're doing well, Anna. You learn quickly." Anna smiled, her hands pressing into the soft dough. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm trying my best." Margaret nodded. "I know. It's not easy, adapting to a new place, especially when there are so many rules. But you're doing well. We're glad to have you here." Anna felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was the closest thing to praise she'd gotten since she arrived. "I'm grateful to be here," she said softly. Margaret smiled, her eyes kind. "Just remember, Anna, we all have our own past. We all carry our own burdens, but we make it work, together." Anna nodded, her chest tightening. She knew there was still so much she didn't understand about this family, about their past, but for now, she was happy to be accepted, even just a little. The bread went into the oven, and the kitchen filled with the warm, comforting aroma of baking. Anna stood by the counter, her eyes on the timer, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. Mark entered the kitchen a short while later, drawn by the smell. He looked at Anna, then at the oven, his eyebrows raising slightly. "You're baking?" Anna nodded, her smile small but genuine. "Margaret's teaching me. I'm making bread." Mark glanced at his mother, who gave him a knowing look. He nodded, his expression softening. "That's good. We could use fresh bread." Margaret smiled, her eyes twinkling. "See? Even Mark approves." Mark gave a small, almost reluctant smile, and Anna felt her cheeks warm. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. She turned her attention back to the oven, watching as the bread began to rise, its crust turning golden. When the bread was ready, Margaret insisted they all sit down together and try it. Anna cut thick slices, her hands steady, and served them to Margaret and Mark. She sat down, her heart pounding slightly as she waited for their reaction. Margaret took a bite first, her eyes closing as she chewed. She nodded, her smile widening. "This is wonderful, Anna. You've done very well." Mark took a bite as well, nodding his approval. "It's good," he said simply, but there was warmth in his voice that Anna hadn't heard before. Anna smiled, a sense of pride filling her chest. For the first time, she felt like she was truly contributing, like she was truly part of something. They sat together, eating the bread, the atmosphere warm and almost comfortable. For a moment, it felt like a family, something Anna hadn't felt in a long time. Later that day, Margaret asked Anna to help her with a small task in the sitting room. She wheeled herself over to a tall bookshelf, nodding at Anna. "There are some old books here that need dusting and organizing. I think it's time we made some space." Anna nodded, moving to the shelf. She pulled down a few books, carefully wiping away the dust. Margaret watched her, her eyes distant. "These books belong to my late husband," Margaret said softly. "He had a lot of secrets, some good, some not so much. I think it's time we let some of these go." Anna paused, looking at Margaret. She could hear the pain in her voice, the weight of those words. "I can help you sort through them," she offered. Margaret smiled, her eyes warm. "Thank you, Anna. It means a lot." They worked together, pulling down old books and deciding which ones to keep and which to let go. Margaret told stories about her husband, some happy, some tinged with sadness. Anna listened, her heart aching for the woman who had clearly been through so much. As the afternoon turned to evening, they finished the task, the bookshelf now more organized, with fewer reminders of the past. Margaret looked at Anna, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've been a great help today, dear," she said, her voice soft. Anna smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. "I'm happy to help, ma'am," Margaret nodded, reaching out to pat Anna's hand. "You're becoming part of this home, Anna. It's not always easy, but you're doing well." Anna felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you. That means a lot." That evening, as they all sat in the sitting room, Margaret spoke again. "Anna, I think it's time you helped more around the house. I'd like you to start taking care of some of the daily chores, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. You've proven you can be trusted." Anna nodded, her chest tight with emotion. "I'd love to, ma'am. I want to do my part." Mark looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Just remember, Anna, it's about trust. We trust you, and you need to trust us. No more looking for answers where there aren't any." Anna nodded, her voice steady. "I understand." The tension in the room seemed to ease a bit, the atmosphere becoming more relaxed. They sat together, the fire crackling in the background, and for the first time, Anna felt like maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where she belonged. She looked at Mark and Margaret, her heart full. She knew there were still secrets in this house, still things she didn't understand, but for now, it was enough to be here, to be trusted, to be part of something. Margaret smiled at her, her eyes softening. "You've come a long way, Anna. We're proud of you." Anna felt her chest swell with emotion, her eyes meeting Margaret. "Thank you. I won't let you down." Margaret nodded, her expression gentle. "We know you won't, dear." The evening continued in quiet companionship, the fire warming the room, the tension that had once filled the house seeming to dissipate, if only for a while. Anna knew she still had a long way to go, but she was determined to make it work. She was determined to be part of this family, to prove she belonged. Morning came with a sense of purpose. Anna woke up, feeling different, as though the house had begun to truly accept her presence. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, the quiet creaking of the old floorboards the only sound that accompanied her. When she reached the kitchen, Margaret was already there, sitting in her usual spot by the table, her knitting needles in her lap. She smiled at Anna, her eyes warm. "Good morning, Anna," Margaret greeted her. "Good morning, ma'am," Anna replied, her smile coming easily. Mark entered a moment later, his expression softened from what it had once been. He poured himself a cup of coffee and looked at Anna. "You're going to be in charge of breakfast today. Let's see if the baking lessons have paid off." Anna nodded, a flicker of excitement running through her. "I'll do my best." She moved to the counter, grabbing ingredients for pancakes. Her hands were steady as she measured flour, cracked eggs, and mixed the batter. She wanted to show them she could handle it, that she was ready for more responsibility. Margaret watched her, a slight smile on her lips. Mark took a seat at the table, and Anna felt his eyes on her as she worked. She tried to ignore the weight of his gaze, focusing instead on getting everything just right. She poured the batter onto the griddle, the sizzle filling the kitchen, the smell of cooking pancakes spreading through the air. When the pancakes were ready, she served them on plates, setting one in front of Margaret and one in front of Mark. She took a seat, her heart pounding a little as she waited for their reaction. Margaret took a bite first, her eyes closing in appreciation. "Delicious, Anna," she said. "You've done very well." Mark took a bite, nodding his approval. "Not bad," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Anna felt her heart swell with pride. She had been waiting for this moment, to be a part of the family in a way that was more than just surviving. Breakfast passed in a comfortable silence, and for once, it felt almost normal, almost like a real family. After breakfast, Margaret turned to Anna, her expression serious but kind. "I think it's time we talked about the future, Anna." Anna blinked, her heart tightening. "The future?" Margaret nodded. "You've been with us for a while now, and I can see you're trying. You want to be here, but staying here means committing. It means understanding what we expect of you and following through." Anna swallowed, her throat dry. "I understand, ma'am. I want to stay." Margaret's eyes softened. "Then you must know, staying here isn't just about following rules, it's about trusting us. We've been through a lot, Mark and I, and we need to know you're not going to leave us like the others did." Anna looked at Mark, his expression unreadable but somehow gentler. She turned back to Margaret. "I won't leave. I want to be here, to help." Margaret smiled, nodding. "Good. That's what we need to hear." Mark stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked over to the window, looking out into the garden. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice low. "Staying here means becoming part of this family, but it also means accepting the secrets that come with it. Anna felt a chill run through her, her heart pounding. What do you mean? Mark turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers. Our father left us with more than just a house. He left us with debts that come in many forms. Some people don't forget what happened here, and some of them might come looking. Anna's eyes widened, her heart racing. She had known there were secrets, but she hadn't realized the extent of them. She felt her stomach twist with fear, but she forced herself to stay calm. Margaret reached over, patting Anna's hand. You have nothing to fear, dear. We'll protect you, just as we've protected each other. But you need to know the risks. Anna nodded slowly, her chest tightening. I understand. Mark looked at her, his eyes searching her face. He seemed to find what he was looking for, because he nodded. Good. We don't expect you to do anything except be careful. Don't go looking for trouble, and don't talk to anyone who comes around asking questions. Understand? Anna nodded again. I understand. Margaret smiled, a small but genuine smile. We want you to be a part of this family, Anna. We need you to trust us, and we need to trust you. Anna swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. I won't let you down, she whispered. Margaret squeezed her hand gently. We know you won't. Mark moved back to the table, sitting down, his expression serious but no longer cold. We'll make this work, Anna. But it means all of us being on the same page. Anna nodded, her heart heavy but hopeful. I'm ready. The day passed in a strange mixture of emotions, hope, fear, and determination. Anna threw herself into her chores, helping Margaret organize some of the old things in the attic, scrubbing the floors, and doing whatever needed to be done. She wanted to prove she could be trusted, that she could pull her weight. In the afternoon, Margaret called Anna into the sitting room. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the garden. She turned to Anna, her eyes warm. Anna, there's something I want you to do for me, she said, her voice soft. Anna nodded, stepping closer. Of course, ma'am. What is it? Margaret reached over to a small wooden box on the table beside her. She opened it, revealing a collection of old keys, each one different in size and shape. She picked one up, holding it out to Anna. This key is to a room upstairs, a room that belonged to my husband, Margaret said. There are things in there that you need to see if you're going to understand this family. I trust you, Anna. Go and take a look. Anna took the key, her fingers trembling. She looked at Margaret, her eyes wide. Are you sure? Margaret nodded, her expression gentle. I'm sure. It's time you understood. Anna swallowed, her heart pounding. She nodded, taking the key. She turned and made her way to the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. She climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached the door, she paused, her hand resting on the old brass handle. She took a deep breath, then inserted the key into the lock, turning it until it clicked. She pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. Anna moved to the window, pulling the curtains back, letting the light flood in. She looked around, her eyes moving over the old furniture, the dusty bookshelves, the faded photographs on the walls. She walked over to a desk, her fingers brushing over the surface. There were papers scattered across it, old letters, documents. She picked up a photograph, her heart tightening as she recognized the face. It was Emily, the girl Mark had told her about. She looked happy in the picture, her smile wide and genuine. Anna set the photograph down, her fingers trembling. She moved to a small cabinet, opening it. Inside, she found a collection of old journals, their covers worn and faded. She pulled one out, opening it. The handwriting was neat, the ink faded with age. It was Margaret's husband's journal, the pages filled with his thoughts, his secrets. Anna sat down, her eyes moving over the words. She read about the debts, the deals that had gone wrong, the people who had been hurt. She read about the guilt he carried, the fear that one day it would all come back to haunt them. She closed the journal, her heart heavy. She understood now. She understood the weight that Mark and Margaret carried, the fear that lingered in this house. She understood why they were so cautious, why they needed her to follow the rules. She stood, placing the journal back in the cabinet. She closed the door, her eyes moving around the room one last time. She knew now that this place wasn't just a refuge. It was a burden, a responsibility, and she was willing to carry that burden, to stay and be a part of this family. She left the room, locking the door behind her. She made her way back downstairs, her heart pounding. Margaret looked up as Anna entered the sitting room, her eyes filled with understanding. You've seen enough then, Margaret asked softly. Anna nodded, her voice steady. I understand now. Margaret smiled, her eyes softening. Good. Then you know what's at stake. You know why we need to trust each other. Anna nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. I won't let you down. Margaret reached out, patting her hand. We know, Anna. We're glad you chose to stay. Anna smiled, her heart full. She knew there were still challenges ahead, still secrets that might come to light. But for now, she was here, with them. She had chosen to stay, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Anna woke up to a crisp morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the trees that surrounded the mansion. The light streamed through the window, bathing the room in a soft golden glow. Today felt different. Today, Anna felt like she truly belonged here. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and as she stepped into the kitchen, she saw Margaret sitting at the table, her knitting in her lap. Mark was there as well, leaning against the counter, his eyes on the window. Good morning, Anna greeted them, her voice cheerful. Margaret looked up and smiled, a warmth in her eyes that Anna had come to cherish. Good morning, Anna. You're up early today? Anna nodded, moving to the counter to make herself a cup of tea. I wanted to get started with the day. There's a lot to do, and I want to make sure I can help. Mark gave her a nod of acknowledgement, his expression softer than it had ever been. There's always plenty to do around here. We appreciate the help. Anna smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She knew this wasn't just a house anymore. It was her home. She had worked hard to earn their trust, and now she felt like she was truly part of this family. Margaret looked at her, her eyes twinkling. I was thinking, Anna, that you might want to help me with some gardening today. The roses are starting to bloom, and they could use a little care. Anna nodded eagerly. I'd love to, ma'am. Mark pushed off the counter, his eyes meeting Anna's. I'll be in the shed if you need any tools. Just let me know. Anna nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction in being trusted enough to take on tasks like this. The day promised to be busy, but she didn't mind. She was happy to be here, to help in any way she could. After breakfast, Anna followed Margaret out to the garden. The roses were in full bloom, their colors vivid against the green backdrop of the garden. Margaret wheeled herself along the path, pointing out which plants needed trimming, which flowers needed extra care. Anna knelt down beside one of the rose bushes, her hands working carefully as she pruned away the dead branches. Margaret watched her, giving her instructions but mostly letting her work at her own pace. You've got a good hand for this, Anna, Margaret said, her voice filled with approval. Anna smiled, her eyes focused on the rose in front of her. I've had a good teacher. Margaret chuckled softly. I suppose we've all been learning from each other, haven't we? Anna looked up, her heart swelling with emotion. She knew Margaret was right. They had all been through so much, and they had all learned to trust each other, to lean on each other. They weren't perfect, but they were making it work. They spent most of the morning in the garden, and by midday, the roses looked better than they had in a long time. Margaret nodded in approval, her eyes filled with warmth. You've done a wonderful job, Anna, she said. Thank you, ma'am, Anna replied, her heart full. Margaret looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and patted her hand. You're a part of this family now, Anna, and that means something. We're glad you're here. Anna felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away, her chest tightening with emotion. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Margaret smiled, and they sat in silence for a while, the sun warming their faces, the sound of birds chirping in the distance. Later in the afternoon, Mark came out to the garden. He walked over to where Anna was working, his eyes scanning the neatly trimmed rose bushes. He nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. You've done well, he said. Anna looked up at him, her face breaking into a smile. Thank you, Mark. He hesitated for a moment, then looked away, his expression softening. There's something I want to show you, he said, his voice low. Anna stood, brushing the dirt off her hands. She followed Mark as he led her around the side of the house, to a small gate that led into a more secluded part of the garden. She had never been back here before, and as they stepped through the gate, she saw a small, overgrown patch of land. Mark gestured to the space. This used to be a vegetable garden, he said. My mother used to take care of it, but after my father passed, it fell into disrepair. I think it's time we brought it back. Anna looked at the garden, her heart pounding. It was overgrown, but she could see the potential there. She looked at Mark, her eyes wide. You want me to help? She asked. Mark nodded. I think it would be good for you. And for us. A fresh start. Anna felt a lump in her throat, her chest tightening. She nodded, her voice steady. I'd love to. Mark gave her a small smile, the warmth in his eyes making her heart swell. Good. We'll start tomorrow. The rest of the day passed in a comfortable blur. Anna helped Margaret with dinner, and they all sat together in the dining room, the air filled with a sense of peace. It was quiet, but it wasn't the tense, uncomfortable silence that had once hung over the house. It was the kind of silence that spoke of understanding, of acceptance. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room, the fire crackling in the fireplace. Margaret worked on her knitting, and Mark read a book, his eyes occasionally flicking to Anna, who sat across from them, her hands folded in her lap. Margaret looked up, her eyes meeting Anna's. You've come a long way since you arrived. Anna, we're proud of you. Anna felt her heart swell, her eyes filling with tears. Thank you. I couldn't have done it without you. Margaret smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. We've all helped each other, haven't we? That's what families do. Anna nodded, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, ma'am. Mark looked at her, his expression softening. We're not perfect, Anna. We have our scars, our secrets, but we're trying, and that's all we can ask of each other. Anna looked at him, her heart full. She knew he was right. They weren't perfect, but they were making it work. They were a family, in their own way. The fire crackled, filling the room with warmth, and they sat together, the quiet companionship filling the space. For the first time, Anna felt at peace. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, that there were still secrets she might never fully understand. But for now, she was here, with them, and that was enough. As the night wore on, Margaret looked at Anna, her eyes twinkling. I think it's time we planted something new in that old garden of ours, something that will grow and remind us of the future we're building. Anna nodded, a smile spreading across her face. I'd like that, ma'am. I'd like that a lot. Mark looked at them both, his eyes softening. Then it settled. Tomorrow, we start fresh. The warmth of the fire, the gentle crackle of the flames, and the presence of Mark and Margaret made Anna feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for a new beginning. Hope for a future where she was no longer lost, but found. She looked at Margaret, then at Mark, her heart swelling with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Margaret reached over, patting her hand. No need to thank us, dear. We're family now. Anna smiled, tears welling in her eyes. Family. The word felt right, felt real. She was no longer alone. She had a home, a place where she was wanted, where she was needed. Tomorrow, they would start again, together. And for Anna, that was more than she could have ever hoped for.